Welcome to this episode of the Justice Team podcast on the Justice Team Network. And today we're going to do something that everybody loves to hear, and that's a little bit of storytelling. And we're going to talk about the effective use of rebuttal argument. So in a trial, we have plaintiff has the burden of proof. I almost said burden of proof. That's a very Freudian Bobbian slip. So we have closing argument, the plaintiff gives, and the defense gives their closing, and then we get what's called rebuttal. Some people call it second argument. But it's your opportunity to defuse all the bombs of the defense. But it's also your opportunity to do what? Robbie Munoz at our firm, one of the best trial lawyers in the nation. What is rebuttal for you, Robbie?
So I think rebuttal is a chance to shore up the most important points in the case. Also think it's a really important chance to storytell. And we're always trying to storytell. We're always trying to effectively get our client's story across. And it's the last chance. It's the last chance to do it. Yeah.
So Robbie's going to give you one where he effectively did a rebuttal and got a $161 million verdict on a product liability case with no comparative on the plaintiff. It was hotly contested liability case, and we'll explain to you why we do certain things after we do that rebuttal. But this is one that worked for Robbie, and you don't have to use specific names, even though it is public record, Robbie.
Sure.
But I want you to give everybody a quick snippet of your rebuttal, the emotional part of it, and why you do it.
Yeah, so my rebuttal, I kind of broke it up into a couple pieces. The first piece was talking about where this corporation began and trying to set the stage of where the conduct began. So going back to this country where it all started and literally talking about connecting that conduct that began in that country 150 years ago as a part of their company's culture and how it made its way all the way to the courtroom that we were standing in. I thought that there was power in being able to explain that this conduct has made its way to the United States, it's made its way to this county, and it's made its way to this courtroom. So I thought that was really effective. And then the second part was talking about how the defendants did not. So they heard our client, they heard everything that our client had gone through, but they didn't really listen. So tapping into that emotion and tapping into this idea that you can hear someone, but if you're not listening to someone, you don't really have a chance to understand their true struggles.
Yeah, and I did not try that case with Robbie, but I think it'd be good for you. Can you give the listeners maybe a few minutes, 5 minutes of that rebuttal from what you can remember? Again, you don't have to use specific names, but kind of how you framed it, because it was so powerful. I got to see the words, but I wasn't there in person.
So we had to go back to Japan. We got to think about where this started, the headquarters in Japan, thinking about how that conduct began there, made its way to the courtroom that we now stand in, but more importantly, talking about how my client had gone through so much pain, so much suffering, really catastrophic injuries, never really had a chance to have his story. I mean, it was heard, but it was not listened to. And that was really going back to, the point that I was trying to make earlier, is that you can have a client suffer catastrophic injuries, be in a jury trial, and not feel seen. So my rebuttal was something like, this company has heard our client, they have heard our client's injuries, but they've never really listened to our client. And they've never really listened to the depth of his harm. And I then changed the focus to the jury and explaining that the jury has a chance to now listen. And the jury has a chance to now do the right thing, and empowering that jury to really root for our client and to make a difference in his life.
Yeah, and I think what Robbie did right there, and this is something we train everybody that we all do, it's you always want to close your rebuttal with the jury empowerment.
Right.
Give them the tools and the power to go in there and right that wrong.
100%. I mean, you're asking them to step up and to help. Mm-hmm. So in that moment, if you can really try to tap into, and for me, I vividly remember looking over and seeing my client as I was doing this rebuttal. I looked over at him, he's emotional, I get emotional, because I really did feel throughout that trial that we had expert witnesses, we had witnesses, damages witnesses. They were all talking about his injuries. They were all talking about, how this had affected him. But even still, I felt like it was falling on deaf ears. I felt like the defense really was not listening. And it became pretty clear that the jury, they were listening. So I took that moment to really highlight the fact that, defense is here. They're basically saying this guy's really not that injured, which is ridiculous because all the evidence pointed to the contrary. They're still fighting this, right? They won't accept any responsibility. And flipping that around and really showing that these folks don't want to listen. They really don't want to pay attention to, the struggle that he's gone through and how terrible it had been.
Yeah, and I'll give what I call it the Goodwill Hunting rebuttal. If everybody knows me, I love pop culture and trivia and things, and this is from the movie Goodwill Hunting. And I'd been watching this movie during this. It was a sex abuse case, and they do a lot of victim blaming, victim shaming, and victim bashing. And same thing when I get to rebuttal, you get to the first part of it. I think you diffuse the bombs that the defense tried to lay out there, the traps, the red herrings, show the jury that they were, again, misconstruing evidence to you. They're trying to trick and confuse you. Give them one big tool. Here's a jury instruction that we win on again. And then I do the Goodwill Hunting rebuttal. And this is where I look every juror in the eyes and I say it once at a time. And I say all that we've heard we've been here for 2-3 weeks, and not once did they ever apologize for what had happened to this teenage girl. They never said they were sorry. They never had any empathy for whatever happened to her. Instead, they came here, they blamed her, they dragged her name through the mud, and you know what? All she wanted to hear. Oh God, I'm getting emotional, Robbie.
Yeah, I know. It's easy to go back to that place.
And you go back and you say all she ever wanted to hear. And I look at like juror number 6. It's not your fault.
Yeah, right.
You did nothing wrong. Look at juror number 4. You didn't deserve this.
Right.
Back to juror number 3. This is not your fault. Back to juror number 6. It's worth every penny what they put you through. Juror number 7. It's not your fault. And I do to every single juror until somebody cries or I cry.
Yeah.
But that's the Goodwill Hunting close. And I'm hitting every single angle and empowering the jury just like you did. Yeah. Empowering that jury to do what's right and show them they have the voice. And that's how I usually end. You have the voice to right that wrong. Yeah. You finally get to speak for her. You finally get to tell her it is not your fault. And that's where I look at her and I can say, it is not your fault. Yeah. And I tell her, it is not your fault. And I sit down.
And like you just touch on something that's so important. I think that if you can make that connection between your client in that space where, you're looking over at your client, I looked over at my client. As soon as I looked over at my client, I got emotional in that rebuttal.
Yeah, that's the hardest. I can do it for jurors, but as soon as you look at your clients, it's waterfall.
Because they're very emotional in that moment. But and another tip is like, listen to your clients, because my client the entire time throughout this entire process leading up to trial and in trial was constantly saying how he feels like nobody was listening to him. I mean, we were listening to him, but that the defense wasn't listening to him, that they really weren't paying attention. So I knew that was important for him too. I knew that was important to give him a sense of closure, right? To talk about how, no one's listened to him. And I think it was kind of cathartic. I think that when I looked over at him and I saw that he was emotional, it was like, finally, someone's fighting for me.
Yeah, and that's where, whether you do whatever close and what I call the Goodwill Hunting close, when I say those things, those are reframe issues I've said throughout trial. Yeah. Like that was a company being held for the sexual predator they had on a workplace, and it was, they set the stage and they're still saying they did nothing. You did nothing wrong. They were supposed to look out for you. You were just a kid. You did nothing wrong. And even whether it's a car crash case, we always say polarize it, that they're a liar, a cheat, and a fraud. That's what their whole case is, that the plaintiff is making it up. So one of those power things, you could look the jurors in the eye, do the same thing. Like, you didn't make it up. Yeah. Your anxiety is real. Yeah. Depression is real. This is not your fault. You did nothing wrong.
100%. And the other thing I forgot about this, because I was saying in the beginning there's 3 points. I was forgetting what one of those 3 were. You have to be really cognizant to listen to defense counsel throughout trial. Take notes. You're going to get a golden nugget at some point, Like they're going to say something at some point
inflammatory.
that you can use, right? And I'll never forget what the defense attorney said. And I immediately wrote it down on my pad of paper, and I circled it because I'm like, I'm coming back to this. And she was talking about, she was crossing the client's mom. And she was asking the client's mom about client's injuries and trying to minimize his injuries. Like saying, well, yeah, but he's, he still does this, right? And he still does that. So like, aren't you just so proud of him? And aren't you just so happy for him that he still gets to do this or do that, and trying to minimize the physical impact it had on him? And she kept saying, aren't you just so proud? Aren't you just so happy? And she said it like 3 times. And I'm like just circling my pad of paper, right? And so when we were on rebuttal, when I went up there, one of my 3 main points was, I went into the listening, they're hearing him, they're not listening. That was powerful. And then you go into, let me give you an example of why they're not listening, right? So my example was tying it back to what that defense attorney did on cross. I said, you remember when Miss So-and-so was up here cross-examining his mom, and she kept saying, aren't you just so proud? And aren't you just so happy? That proves that they still do not listen, because they've ignored all of the pain and suffering that he's gone through. Mm-hmm. And if they were listening, they would understand. And I had like so many jurors nodding their heads when I connected those.
And, it's important is, cadence is important. You just want to slow down your heartbeat, slow down your words, talk with passion. Talk like this.
I don't have a hard time slowing down.
You're slower cadence. I'm a very fast talker. But that's what's, and one thing that I've started a lot of rebuttal arguments over is, I stand up and I say, I've been sitting here and I've been kind of like gripping counsel table so hard that my knuckles were turning white. Yeah. And I was just so mad, like listening to the defense lawyer get up here and say all these things that I know aren't true. That's not true. Yeah. And I get so mad and frustrated with it. And if I'm mad, think about how my client feels sitting back there. Mm-hmm. And then I realized that, that anger that I feel is actually like a surface emotion, and that surface emotion is for fear. Like I'm afraid that you're going to be, the 12 of you are going to be swindled by these things that aren't true. And then I go back to jury selection. I remember talking to all of you, and everybody said, we can follow the law, we can follow the facts. We're not going to be dissuaded by these red herrings, and that's that gave me peace. Yeah. It gave me peace, and I started a lot of rebuttal arguments off like that.
Yeah, I think that if you can constantly tie things back to, it's like a continuum, right? So if you're going back on that timeline and you're picking little spots that your jurors can say, oh yeah, I remember that, or oh yeah, I remember when he said that. You're like building that connection with the jury, and you're giving them those aha moments, mm-hmm. right? And that moment happened when I talked about, the defense attorney saying what she did, because, I had multiple jurors like looking around my body, like trying to see her reaction when I said that, because it's true. Like, you think about those moments in trial that really stick with you, and you can use those on rebuttal. You can really be effective to make a huge impact. You're trying to land punches.
Yep.
Ultimately,
land punches.
Right? You're trying to land punches. So you got to take what's coming at you, and you're going to take some shots. You're going to move and you're going to take some shots, but you have to be ready to counter. You got to be ready to let your hands go. So rebuttal's that chance to package it all together and give your life.
And hit them quick, hit them hard.
That's it.
Knock under the mat.
That's it. Some quick combinations.
Thank you, Robbie Munoz, former boxer, now lawyer, and probably the only trial lawyer I know that had plaintiff verdicts while in law school.
That's
Robbie
right.
Munoz.
Two.
That's right.
Two
verdicts winning. And that's what, anybody that's out there listening, don't everybody tell you're too young, you don't got enough experience, you just need a team around you to make sure you succeed.
That's right.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Justice Team Podcast on the Justice Team Network. If you want to hear more, just go to that website, www.justicesteamnetwork.com. Click on case evaluation, or if you want to be a guest, and we sure as heck will get back to you.
All right.
Robbie,
thanks, guys.
You did nothing wrong. It's not your fault.
I know.
You are good at that.